Hey, what's going on, everyone? Jim here, and I'm back with another movement challenge for you to try. Today's movement challenge is all about working on rotational mobility within the hip joint, that big ball and socket joint that sits in the hip that controls essentially how we move our entire leg. Now, here's how the video is going to work. I'm going to quickly show you a video of what the movement looks like. Then we're going to come back to this screen briefly because I'm going to explain about why rotational hip mobility is such an important thing for the health of the hip joint. And then we're going to go back to the exercise. I'm going to break it down a bit further for you and show you ways that you can make it easier or a little bit more challenging based on your own needs. So with that being said, here is the movement. So I start with both of my knees bent to 90 degrees, and then while keeping my heels on the ground, I just rotate back and forth from side to side, just like a windshield wiper on a windshield. Now what's happening here is as I do this, one hip has to move inwards or rotate internally, while the other has to rotate outwards or externally. So if I'm finding it too difficult, I just straighten my knees out and then I try and do the movement from there. Now there's less range of motion that the hip has to go through, and so that might be more appropriate for you and might feel more comfortable. And again, if it's still too difficult, I just lean back and I straighten my knees even more, and then I try the movement from there. Less range of motion here, less challenge for the hip, and again, that might be what you need. So play around with it. It should always feel comfortable. There shouldn't be anything uncomfortable about this movement. So when we're talking about working rotational mobility, that internal and external rotation of the hip, what's the big deal with wanting to be good at that? Well, there's a lot of reasons why. I'm only going to talk about one main reason for today, and that is in order to keep the joint healthy. So a lot of times, joints can start to become unhealthy because they're actually not getting appropriate movement or getting enough movement. And this largely happens with the hip, that big ball and socket joint, because we oftentimes move the hip forward and backwards as we walk and do other daily activities, but we're oftentimes not getting that kind of internal or external rotation around the ball and socket joint. So there's the socket of the hip, there's the big thigh bone coming right in through there, and we're not getting enough of that internal or that inward or external outward twisting of the thigh bone and the joint itself. And so what happens there is fluid around the joint surfaces can kind of become stagnant and become this unhealthy fluid environment for these joints. And so when we actually get movement around those joints, we're flushing the fluid that sits around the surfaces of those two joints. So joints within the body, particularly when we talk about the hip joint, there's cartilage or this kind of shiny, hard, dense tissue that sits on top of each joint surface. And that cartilage needs that fluid exchange moving around in order to keep the joint healthier and happier. So when we work on internal and external rotation of the hip like we're doing in this movement, we're just making sure that one of the many things that we're doing here is actually moving fluid around that joint. Now there's other tissue phenomenons that are happening here with working tissue mobility and everything else, but right now we're just looking at moving fluid around that hip joint. We could talk about the hip capsule and muscles crossing over the hip joint, but for today's educational purpose, we're just thinking about moving the joint to maintain good fluid movement around the surfaces of the joint. So as we break down this 90-90 hip rotation movement with the knees being at 90-degree angles for the movement, let's quickly run through a couple other things we need to be aware of. Now, structurally, all of us might actually have slightly different hips in terms of a couple of anatomical features. So some people can actually have a more shallow hip socket where the head of the femur bone or the thigh bone sits into. We can also have structural differences in terms of the amount of actual kind of torsion around the thigh bone and how that relates to how the hip moves in these types of positions. We call that things like anteversion and retroversion of the hip. Now, I won't get into details of that, but you can definitely read up more on it if you want to. The big thing we need to be aware of here, though, is that if you're trying to do this movement and you do feel a very sharp pinch in the front of your hip and it's happening every single time you try and do this, then this movement is not for you, or you need to modify it in a way where that pinching is not happening. What likely is going on there, if it's a very sharp pinching sensation and it's happening every single time, is there's kind of a bony anomaly happening where, again, part of one bone is actually hitting the actual kind of rim of the socket joint itself. These are things that we call femoral acetabular impingement, or FAI. It's just a little condition where there's some kind of bony growths that are causing some discomfort when you're trying to move the hip. So again, if you want to read up more on that, there's things like a cam lesion and a pincer lesion. You can read up on those, but that's not really the scope of this video. So when we do this movement, what we're looking at doing ideally is having the knees in 90-degree positions, and then from here, we're just simply going to rotate over to the other side. Now, what that creates is a big rotational movement around each hip. One hip, each time I go to one side, one hip is having to produce an internal rotation of the thigh bone, meaning the thigh bone is kind of moving towards the middle of the body, while the other thigh bone is doing external rotation, which refers to moving the thigh bone or rotating it around away from the middle of the body. And so there's internal rotation here, external rotation here, and then it's the opposite as I come through here. Now, as long as I can do this and it feels good, I can do it as much as I want, and I can do additional movements where I maybe kind of lean forward a little bit and kind of increase more range of motion at the hip, playing around with it for whatever feels best. Now, if the 90 degrees is too difficult or it's uncomfortable, we can actually make it a little bit easier by actually increasing the angle of the knees and just doing rotational movements through here. Again, just to whatever extent is appropriate for you. All we're doing here is we're putting a lot of movement, rotational movement specifically, around the ball and socket joint. We're keeping that hip, the joint itself, healthy by just moving a lot of fluid around it. And then again, healthy joints need to have movement. And so we're just putting some healthy little movement in there. This feels fine for me. So again, I'm going to increase it to 90 degrees here, rotate up and over right through there. Nice little hip stretch and mobility challenge. Can definitely feel it. Great thing to do. Play around with it. See what it's going to take to make it feel appropriate for you, but just a great way to get that rotational movement and mobility around the hip joint. So that's the movement. Now, this is something that's pretty easy to incorporate into your daily regimen. If you just have a minute to sit down and just work that gentle rotation to an extent that is appropriate for you, then you might find that this actually starts to make the hips feel better if they're feeling tight or restricted, or they just haven't been getting enough of that internal and external rotational movement. Now, I won't go into much more anatomy or other details of the hip for this video, but if you're curious or you want to learn more, leave your question in the comment section below and I'll do what I can to answer it as appropriately as possible. Now, as always, I'm just going to finish the video off here by saying that if you are enjoying the content that I'm putting out, if you're finding it helpful or informative or enjoyable, or you just really want to help support this channel, then please consider hitting the like and subscribe button. What this does is this helps me to continue putting out content that I can provide not only to you, but to anyone else who is interested in learning more about healthy movement, keeping our bodies healthy, eliminating pain, avoiding pain, or the whole world of physical therapy in general. So please consider hitting the like and subscribe button if you haven't already done so. That would mean a ton to me. And if you have other hip mobility exercises or drills that you like to do, I want to hear all about them. Please leave them in the comment section below because I love learning new movements and trying new things. And so I'm looking forward to learning about what I can learn from you. So that's it for the video. Everyone take care of yourselves. I hope you're doing well. I hope you're continuing to make great things happen. Take care of yourselves, and I'll see you in the next video.